The skald slowly stood up, the sound of crackling flames breaking the silence of the night. The fire danced with the light of death and renewal, illuminating his face, marked by time and the secrets of many generations. His eyes shone with the fire of wisdom and mystery, and the listeners, in absolute silence, awaited the words that would come next. The wind blew softly through the trees, as if the air itself was waiting for the beginning of what was to come. "My friends," the skald began, his voice grave, deeper than the sound of distant thunder. He paused, letting the weight of the silence make itself felt, like a heavy hand on the hearts of those present. "The time that brought us here is older than the stones we walk on. But what I will tell you now, this is the end of all stories, the end of legends, the end of time." He looked at the fire as if it were a reflection of what was to come. Conrad, Odin's chosen one, the man who looked Ragnarok in the eye and knew he could not run, has reached a point where the gods themselves look to him with expectation. He has crossed the realms, faced the forces of destruction, defied fate itself. He has not stopped. He has not given in. But now, my friends, the true battle is about to begin. The skald raised his horn of mead, his eyes fixed on the faces around the fire. Ragnarok, the end of the world, is closer than any of us could have imagined. Fenrir, the wolf, grows larger with each passing moment, and his hunger is insatiable. The earth trembles, and the sky weeps in fire. Destruction walks beside us, but Conrad, with a king's sword, did not waver. He did not retreat. He knew that the fate that awaited him was no longer a choice. He knew that when he entered the last city, when he crossed the gates of the realm where the gods walk, he would face something far greater than any battle he had ever fought. The skald smiled bitterly, the golden drink on his lips. The realm where the gods dwell, where the fates of men and gods intertwine. This sacred land, my friends, is where the truth will be revealed. Where Conrad, the last warrior, will find the truth of his destiny and face the greatest challenge of all. What he will find there, among the gods, is something that not even the greatest warriors have dared to dream of. He looked into the fire, his smile both knowing and sad. But Conrad, my friends, is no longer a man. He is no longer the warrior you once knew. He is now the sword of destruction, the blade the gods have forged for this moment. And what will happen when he meets those who rule destiny? Will he be the bearer of the last hope, or will he be consumed by the very force that created him? The atmosphere around him seemed to change, as if the night were preparing to receive the greatest of challenges. Ragnarok is coming, and with it, the fall of all we know. But within Conrad, there is a flame of courage that can light even the end of time. The skald took one last look at the horizon, the flame of the fire reflecting in his eyes, and slowly leaned back. But that, my friends, is a tale for the end of the night. And like all great things, the end of this saga cannot be told without first knowing what the gods truly expect of a man like Conrad. With these words, the skald fell silent, and the sound of the flames seemed to intensify. The wind whispered through the trees, as if waiting for what would come next. And in that moment, everyone knew that the end was near. The wind howled furiously, cutting through the skin like blades of ice, as the longship, with its black sails, advanced through the icy and treacherous waters. The sailor, with the same calm as ever, kept control of the helm, guiding the vessel with precision. Conrad, on the other hand, looked at the horizon with a feeling of growing tension. He had visited the 8 kingdoms, delivering his message, warning the kings, the warriors, and the peoples everywhere. Ragnarok was approaching, and he knew that his destiny was intertwined with its imminent end. But something inside him told him that there was more to his journey than he could have ever imagined. He had been chosen, yes, but for what greater purpose? The weight of the mission seemed to increase with each passing day, and he felt a growing pressure, as if the weight of the heavens themselves were on his shoulders. He knew that there was only one realm left to visit, Asgard, the home of the gods, where the truth, he felt, would finally be revealed. With the sight of the frozen land approaching, the sailor finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the wind. "Here we are, Conrad, the last step before your destiny is fulfilled. But know that the journey that lies ahead is not only about fighting the end of times. You are about to learn a truth that few mortals can understand." Conrad eyed the sailor suspiciously, but said nothing. What else could he do but follow? Follow the path that the gods had chosen for him. With a sigh, he pushed himself away from the edge of the boat and walked to the side, towards the icy beach where they would disembark. The island where the longship docked was a land of immense coldness, covered in a thick layer of snow and ice, with imposing mountains in the distance, surrounding the coast. It was a desolate land, devoid of apparent life, a stillness that seemed to hide something greater, something waiting to be revealed. Conrad walked along the snow-covered beach, feeling the snow and ice crunch beneath his feet. The wind bit at his face, but he remained immune to it, his mind focused on one thing, the next step of his journey. He had warned the kingdoms. He had done what was necessary. But the next step was beyond anything he had ever done. He stood in the middle of the beach, staring out at the endless, icy horizon. And in that moment, he felt an intense pressure in his chest, as if something were calling to his soul. He fell to his knees, not out of weakness, but out of necessity. He knew that if Ragnarok was truly at his door, he needed to prepare for what was to come. "Odin, All-Father," Conrad murmured, his voice low and reverent. "Give me the wisdom to face what is to come. May I know what to do, and may I not fail." The sound of the wind seemed to grow louder, as if the very trees of the island were listening to his words. Conrad's raven, which had been sitting quietly on his shoulder the entire journey, took flight, soaring above him, its black wings cutting through the frigid air. Conrad watched the raven, feeling a sense of something larger in the air, something inexplicable. But then, in the blink of an eye, the raven's figure began to distort, its wings morphing into a larger, more imposing shadow. The raven writhed, its body expanding into a human form. Conrad was stunned as he watched, a wave of surprise and confusion running down his spine. Before him now stood not the raven, but a figure of immense power. The man before him was dark-skinned as night, with a flowing cloak and a grave countenance. He stared at Conrad with piercing eyes, and for an instant the very air around him seemed to bend at his presence. The sailor, who had remained silent until that moment, began to laugh, a deep laugh that echoed like thunder. "Ah, Conrad, you are closer than you think." Conrad, surprised and perplexed, looked at the sailor, who was now dissolving his own form. The man beside him slowly disappeared, revealing his true self. The long, golden hair, the austere countenance, and the intense eyes of a god. Conrad came to his senses, his knees shaking with the revelation. "Odin was not the only one guiding you, Conrad," said the man who now revealed himself before him. "I am Tyr, the god of war, the god who protects warriors and true heroes." Conrad could hardly believe the words he was hearing. He looked at Tyr, and with a trembling voice, said, "So, all this, everything I have done so far, was part of a greater plan?" Tyr nodded, his expression softening, but the gravity of his words remained. "Yes, young warrior, from the moment you took up the king's sword, you were marked for something greater. Ragnarok is about to begin, and you, Conrad, are the only one capable of defeating Fenrir. Not Odin, not any other god. Only you." Conrad felt a chill run down his spine, but something inside him flared. He was being guided, protected, but most importantly, he was a chosen one. He, and he alone, could destroy the very wolf that had been prophesied to destroy the gods. He was the one who would take the final stand against Fenrir. But before he could utter a word, the sky darkened, and a distant roar echoed across the island. It was a deep, earth-shattering sound. The wolf's shadow began to grow, and the wind carried with it the scent of death. Fenrir was coming. "He is stronger than ever," Tyr said, his tone grave. "The fate of the world is in your hands, Conrad. Now, you must make your way to Asgard, where the final battle will be fought. Ragnarok cannot be avoided, but it can be defied." The earth shook, and the sky seemed to crumble with the force of the approaching wolf. Fenrir was now more monstrous, more ferocious, more terrifying than ever. His red eyes glowed with the rage of an entire era of destruction, and his footsteps echoed like a harbinger of the end. Conrad, with the king's sword in his hands and the truth finally revealed, knew his fate was sealed. The final journey would be the hardest, but he was ready. The final kingdom awaited him, and with it, the end of the world and the chance to save everything he loved. The wind tore through the land with a fierce intensity, as if nature itself knew what was coming. Fenrir, the wolf of destruction, had already grown beyond measure. His roar echoed like distant thunder, and his presence made the earth tremble beneath his feet. But he was not alone. As the storm approached, beings from other lands, men and creatures from the darkest realms, joined his cause. Ragnarok was no longer a legend or a mere threat. It was coming to pass, and an army of horrors gathered under the wolf's shadow. On the dark fields, a legion of warriors from many lands prepared for war. Lost men, who had fallen in previous battles, were resurrected by the dark forces. Deformed creatures, with skin of stone and bones of iron, marched alongside them. The dark elves of Svartalfheim, with their poisonous arrows and eyes blinded by hatred, formed a deadly line alongside armies of the undead from Niflheim. Muspelheim, with its eternal flames, sent forth its flaming beasts, their claws as sharp as razors. The union of all these beings under Fenrir's command formed an unstoppable force, an army that would consume everything in its path. And at the center of it all, the immense wolf, whose eyes glowed with primal rage, led the march to destruction. He tore through the sky with his screams, his jaws opening to devour the sun and swallow the gods. What had once been a legend was now a terrifying reality, and the land began to prepare for the greatest war of all. But as Fenrir and his army approached, elsewhere in the world, Conrad was on a journey of his own. Alongside Tyr, the god of war, and Odin, the All-Father, he traveled towards Asgard, the last hope of the realms. The journey was silent, but fraught with tension. The weight of the king's sword was heavier than ever, and the presence of Tyr and Odin at his side made Conrad feel small, as if he were a pawn in a game where he did not understand all the rules. The journey to Asgard was arduous, and the cutting wind from the north seemed to try to stop the three travelers. Conrad, however, did not hesitate. He knew that the fate of the world was in his hands, and his determination grew with each step. The lands they passed through were deserted, with signs of destruction and chaos at every corner. Fenrir was coming, and nothing could be done to stop the advance of destruction, but there was something greater at stake, something that Conrad did not yet fully understand. As they walked, Odin looked at Conrad with a watchful eye. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked, his voice echoing through the wind. "The sword, Conrad, it is not just a blade. It was forged for a destiny, and you are its guardian." Conrad stared at the king's sword, which glowed with a soft light, as if it had a life of its own. With each passing day, he felt a stronger connection to it. It was no ordinary sword. He knew that. But what had Odin meant? What else did it represent besides a tool for battle? As they walked in silence, the answer revealed itself. Conrad felt a growing heat in the blade, a vibration that ran up his arm and spread throughout his body. He felt the strength of something ancient within him. The sword was more than just being carried by him. It was becoming an extension of his soul. In an instant of clarity, Conrad understood. The sword was not just blessed. It was a blade of destiny, forged by the gods for a greater purpose. She was under his protection, because he was the only one capable of using her power to challenge Fenrir. The real battle was not just about fighting the wolf, but about Conrad's own role in preserving the world. He was the chosen one, the bearer of the blade that could end Ragnarok. Finally, after days of traveling, Conrad, Odin, and Tyr reached the entrance to Asgard. The realm of the gods was more imposing than Conrad could have imagined. Marble towers gleamed in the sun, and the heavens seemed closer, as if the realm itself floated between the world of men and the world of the gods. Asgard was a place where destinies intertwined, and the weight of their mission seemed to increase with each step they took. The gates of Asgard opened before them, and Conrad stepped inside, feeling the eyes of the Asgardian fall upon him. They were ready for battle. The streets were filled with warriors prepared for war, in golden armor and shining helmets. The eagles soared high, and Thor's lightning bolts lit up the sky. Everything was ready for the final showdown, but Conrad knew he still had something to discover. As they entered the great hall, Odin approached the celestial altar and removed an imposing suit of armor. It was made of a shining golden metal, adorned with ancient runes and symbols of power. The light emanating from the armor was blinding, and Conrad, not knowing what to expect, looked at Odin, his heart beating faster. This armor was forged by the gods themselves. Odin said, his tone grave, "It is for you, Conrad, for the final confrontation. For, as you will discover, you are not just an ordinary man. You are a descendant of Thor." Conrad was silent. He had never imagined that he would be more than a simple warrior, but there, before that celestial armor, he felt something awaken within him, a part of his lineage that he had never known. He was a descendant of one of the greatest gods of Asgard, Thor himself, the god of thunder. The shock was immense. How had he never known this? The weight of this revelation seemed to crush him, but it also gave him strength. He, Conrad, was more than a chosen one. He was of the lineage of a god, and now he understood the purpose of his mission. He was not only fighting for the world, but for all the legacy that he carried in his veins. And so, his transformation began, now a celestial, with white hair and blue eyes shining brightly. As Conrad processed all this, the sky suddenly darkened. The sound of a distant roar echoed across the lands, as a sign that Fenrir was closer than ever. The wolf was advancing, and with him, the army of destruction. Conrad looked at the sword, now shining more intensely, and felt the presence of Thor in his spirit. The battle was about to begin. The earth, the sky, and the gods were preparing for the final confrontation. And Conrad, with the king's sword and the celestial armor, was ready to face the greatest challenge of all, the end of the world. The sky of Asgard, which had once reflected the peace and power of the gods, was now a canvas of flames. Lightning cut through the dark clouds like sharp blades, and thunder roared like the cry of the gods themselves, testifying to the beginning of the end. Asgard, the last refuge of divine civilization, was transformed into a war zone. The golden columns of the palaces began to crack. The earth shook with the force of something beyond understanding, and destruction spread rapidly. On the side of the gods, the last bastion of resistance were preparing to face the terror of an invasion that would come from the depths of the abyss itself. Fenrir's army was immense, composed of creatures from other lands, beings whose eyes burned with a desire for destruction and chaos. Creatures from Svartalfheim, dark elves with poisoned arrows and dark armor, marched alongside stone giants whose footsteps made the earth tremble. Beside them, undead warriors, resurrected from Niflheim, raised their rusty swords with a guttural cry, ready for war. But the leader of this apocalyptic horde was Fenrir. The wolf that had been prophesied to bring about the end of all the gods was now more immense than anyone could have ever imagined. His red eyes glowed with a rage that could consume the very heavens, and his presence spread an aura of death. Every step he took caused the earth to split apart, and the force of his march left a trail of destruction in his wake. He roared, and his cries seemed to shatter the boundaries of the universe, sending shockwaves that shook Asgard and the lands beyond. But on the other side of the battle, the gods were prepared. Thor, with his hammer Mjolnir in hand, stood at the center of the defense line. The sound of the lightning and thunder he summoned was deafening, each blow of his hammer resounding like a heavenly explosion. Thor's energy seemed unstoppable, his strength equal to thunder itself. Each time he threw Mjolnir into the air, the impact of the divine weapon devastated hordes of enemies, and the sky lit up with flashes of pure divine fury. But despite Thor's power, the tide of war seemed to be tilting ever closer towards defeat. Fenrir and his armies were unwilling to retreat. They advanced like an immeasurable wave, no matter how many fell. The number of enemies was so great, and their strength so immense, that even the gods began to feel the weight of the battle. The ground of Asgard shook with the impact of the attacks, and flames began to consume the great buildings of the kingdom. Conrad, the chosen one, stood at the center of this battle, his sword shining with an intense light, as if it carried the very essence of the gods. Each blow he struck cut through Fenrir's armies with supernatural precision and strength. He was no longer an ordinary man. The sword he carried was not just a blade, but the will of the gods themselves. He cut through the ranks of dark elves with one swing, his enemies falling in droves, but even he knew that the true showdown was yet to come. The battle had only just begun. He charged forward with relentless determination, his heart pounding in his chest, the heat of war coursing through his bones. The weight of his mission was there, the king's sword in his hands, the last hope of the kingdoms, and he knew that the only way to prevent the end of everything was to defeat Fenrir. But the wolf was there, waiting for him. The battle took a new turn when, on the horizon, Conrad saw the majestic figure of a unicorn, its horn glowing golden, advancing towards him. A sense of power and connection with nature coursed through Conrad's entire body. The unicorn, with its ethereal strength, approached with unearthly grace. Conrad did not hesitate. He mounted the magical creature and, with a war cry, charged forward to face the wolf of destruction. The unicorn shot forward with supernatural speed, crossing the battlefield with an agility that seemed to defy reality itself. Fenrir, upon seeing Conrad approach, let out a deep, disdainful laugh, as if the mere fact that Conrad would challenge the greatest of monsters was a joke. You, a mere mortal, will defy the end of all that is. Fenrir snarled with a sneer, his eyes burning like the fire of the abyss. You are but a leaf in a storm, a grain of sand in the sands of time. There is no force that can defeat me. But Conrad, seized by an unknown force, did not hesitate. Something inside him had awakened, something ancient, something he did not fully understand. The power of his ancestors, of Odin and Thor, seemed to run through his veins. He advanced with all the strength of his being, the sword shining like an extension of his soul. With each movement he made, the blade cut through the air as if it were the very essence of life. He was not only fighting for survival, he was fighting for the balance of all worlds. Fenrir reacted with fury, his razor-sharp claws slicing through the air, but Conrad was faster. He dodged, moving with supernatural agility, delivering a deadly blow to the wolf's side. The impact was so strong that the very ground of Asgard shook, but Fenrir, with a deafening roar, rose up, retaliating with even greater fury. He attacked with an overwhelming force, his sharp teeth threatening to destroy everything in its path. The battle between Conrad and Fenrir became a deadly dance, a clash where the fate of all world hung in the balance. Every blow seemed to resonate across the 9 realms. Every clash between Conrad and the wolf seemed to scratch at reality itself. Conrad's power, fueled by the sword and the strength of the gods, made the impossible seem possible. And Fenrir, with his uncontrollable fury, retaliated with the force of a hurricane, delivering blows that could destroy any other warrior. But Conrad would not give in. He knew that if he fell, everything would end. Ragnarok would be complete, and there would be nothing left but destruction. He had to win. He had to destroy the wolf. The end of the worlds was in his hands. Finally, with a cry of strength, Conrad raised his sword, channeling all the energy of the gods. With a devastating blow, he plunged the blade into Fenrir's heart. The wolf, with a final roar of pain and rage, fell to the ground with a crash that echoed throughout Asgard, its enormous paws striking the ground with force. The impact was so great that the earth itself seemed to tremble, and the sky, previously dark and turbulent, began to lighten. Fenrir, the great wolf, the god of destruction, was finally defeated. Fenrir's forces, seeing their leader fall, stopped fighting. The destruction he had brought seemed to dissipate, and his followers, the creatures of the shadows and the undead, fell to their knees before the power of Conrad. Asgardians and enemies alike watched the chosen warrior, the man who defeated Ragnarok, and began to shout his name in unison. Conrad, the one who defeated Ragnarok. The Asgardians cheered, their voices echoing through the halls of Asgard. Odin's chosen one, the last warrior, the hero who brought an end to chaos. Conrad, panting and covered in sweat and blood, looked down at Fenrir's body, the sword still embedded in his chest. The sky, which had been dark and threatening before, was now beginning to lighten, and the light of the gods seemed to return to the land. Ragnarok was finally over, and the world was saved. But the name of Conrad, the man who faced the end, would echo through the ages as a hero who defied the gods themselves and won. The Skald, his face illuminated by the dancing flames, slowly stood up. The silence around the fire was profound, each person feeling the weight of what had been said. The sound of the wind and the crackling of the wood seemed to amplify the gravity of the words that were about to be spoken. And so, my friends, the Skald began, his deep, piercing voice echoing in the shadows that surrounded the circle of warriors and villagers. He paused, letting the silence grow even longer. The battle, the great war that began with the roar of Fenrir, was fought in Asgard, where fate itself bent. Ragnarok, the destruction of the gods, was at hand, but Odin's chosen one, Conrad, faced what many believed impossible. He paused, his eyes narrowing, as if looking away at the battlefields, at the ruins of Asgard, where the fate of all worlds was sealed. Conrad, Conrad, the Skald said, an almost holy reverence in his voice. He was no longer just a man, but the hero of the gods, the wielder of the blade that could sever fate itself. He knew that if he did not win, all that existed, all that was loved, would fall. But he did not back down. He faced Fenrir, the wolf of destruction, the end of all that had been, with a courage that transcended humanity itself. The Skald raised his mead horn, and a shadow of longing passed over his face as he took a sip, as if drinking in the very story he was about to tell. And then, my friends, with a sword forged by the gods and blessed by Odin himself, Conrad struck the final blow. The blade slashed through Fenrir's heart, and the wolf, the beast that had threatened to destroy all the realms, fell. The earth shook, the sky split open, and the light of the god began to return, like a dawn after the fiercest storm. The Skald looked at each of his listeners, his eyes filled with a deep weight, as if he himself were experiencing that victory all over again. Fenrir has fallen, and with him Ragnarok has been challenged. Fenrir's forces, seeing their leader fall, surrendered. The chaos he had caused was undone, and the kingdoms began to rebuild. But most of all, my friends, Conrad's name will not be forgotten. He was not just a man who defeated the end. He was a hero who united gods and mortals in a fight against destruction. The Skald gazed into the fire, his hands steady, as if touching the past itself. The Asgardians, their hearts aflame with gratitude, cried out his name, Conrad, the victor of Ragnarok. And so he will be remembered as the hero who had the courage to fight against his own destiny. It was not only his sword that made him victorious, but his strength, his courage, his indomitable spirit. He was, after all, the chosen one, the descendant of Thor, and not just any man, but a warrior capable of defying his own end. He took a deep breath, as if absorbing the full weight of the story, and his voice became softer, almost a whisper, as he slowly leaned back to his position around the fire. And so, my friends, the legend of Conrad, the man who defied the gods and defeated Ragnarok, will be sung for generations to come. The end is not the end. The end is only the beginning. Conrad's sword, the blade of destiny, lives on in our hearts. And as long as there is courage, as long as there are men and women willing to fight, the name of Conrad, the conqueror of Ragnarok, will live on forever. The Skald looked back at his listeners, his eyes now glowing with an inner flame, as if he were part of the story he was telling. He took another sip of mead, and the sound of the liquid being poured into the cup seemed to fill the silence. And so, my dears, we conclude this great saga. Ragnarok has been defied, but new winds blow. Conrad's fate, and ours, is still being written in the stars, in the fire, and in the earth. With an enigmatic smile, the Skald slowly rose, and his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the stars shone like the eyes of the gods. But that, my friends, my friends, is a story for another night. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.